Уважаемые коллеги, как вы уже знаете, кафедра классической филологии продолжает цикл лекций зарубежных профессоров по классической филологии и различным ее дисциплинам. И вот сегодня у нас в гостях профессор Ioannis Petropoulos. Ioannis Petropoulos учился в Оксфорде, где был студентом и членом Линкольн-колледжа. Затем он обучался в Гарвардском университете и, соответственно, закончил его сумма кум лауде и в дальнейшем работал в нескольких местах, из которых следует отметить то, что профессор Petropoulos был директором Центра эллинских исследований, Center for Hellenic Studies, а именно греческого филиала Центра греческих исследований, то есть с 2008 по 2019 годы. Ну и в настоящий момент, как я уже сказал, он является профессором Фракийского университета имени Демокрита. Вы можете ознакомиться у нас на сайте, в том числе с списком работ профессора Petropoulos. Они посвящены самым различным проблемам, в основном греческой литературы, что и неудивительно, зная его замечательных учителей. И вот сегодня тоже вы услышите две лекции по этим проблемам греческой литературы. Соответственно, я так понимаю, the order is the same. So
it would be on monsters, yes.
Yes. Итак, сегодня мы начнем с темы «Литературное изображение чудовищ и сверхъестественных явлений в некоторых сюжетах у Гомера и Гесиода».
Thank you, dear colleague.
I'm sorry.
My books are, yes, as usual.
A bit. Not to worry.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you once again for the gracious invitation. And I must say that I'm very honoured to be here. This is my first visit to your university, and also my first time in Russia. Well, my subject is essentially monsters, and trying to define them, and early monsters in ancient Greek literature, namely in Homer and Hesiod. I'm not an expert in art, so I shall entirely leave out of my scope any art historical treatment. But my remarks are intended to be a bit experimental, and I really would appreciate your feedback in whatever form, whatever language. I don't, sadly, I don't speak Russian, your very, very beautiful language. but we can do it, we can discuss things in English or modern Greek if you like, or French. But I encourage you to react to this very, very preliminary paper. And I subtitled it this morning, forgive me, Be My Guest. It's meant to be humorous, but it's I know, when you explain humour, it's like dissecting a frog, but it's really about the Cyclops at the end, the famous Cyclops. And today in the Pushkin Museum, I saw an extraordinary painting of the Cyclops, an Italian, I think, Renaissance painter. Anyway, academic monster mania promises allure and amusement park entertainment in classics, much to its popularizing benefit, but sometimes sensationalizes the role and over-represents the importance of hybrid and other strange mongers of mayhem and disorder. As a means of probing philological aporemata, Homeric monsters, in particular, may prove useful, suggesting insights or prompting insights into, for example, compositional and narrative alternatives open to the master narrator. Over and above their rampant weirdness, monsters can, in a serious sense, lead us also into the realm of the mysterium tremendum of ancient theology, an intersection which, with exceptions, I believe, has been underappreciated. Monsters are ciphers, symbols, not only of divinity, but also aesthetics, Longinian sublimity and Julia Kristeva's abjection, and paramountly, as a still unplumbed archive of literary and subliterary figures and foils. In the Theogony, monsters are born before the establishment of Zeus's reign, and therefore before the birth of the Muses. Monsters exist before song and poetry. After vanquishing Typhoeus, the youngest and most fearsome of monsters, a half-brother of the Titans, Zeus ascends to the throne and after several marriages mates with Mnemosyne, a Titaness, by whom he procreates the Muses. That's in Theogony 9:15 and following. Had he failed to eliminate Typhoeus, there would be no Muses, no socially constructive speech inspired by them, no song, and no theogony. One of the subjects listed in the poem's unusually explicit table of contents, that's verses 105 through 7, that's number 1 on the handout. This table of contents mentions, and I translate, those whom briny Halmuros, Pondos, sea, nurtured. 107, which include a son, Phorcus, and a daughter, Cato, who in turn produced, if I'm not mistaken, 4 generations of monsters, such as the Graiai and the Chimera, or Chimera, most of whom, or which, are killed or subdued by heroes. Indeed, monsters, which are by and large antisocial, anti-cultural, destructive entities, ironically make up a large part of the poem, the performance of which is meant to consolidate social cohesion and calm via the rule of kings, basileis, that's Theogony 80 and following, which features the honourable mention of the muse, Calliope. What is a monster? or rather, what does Hesiod and Homer, or Hesiodic and Homeric poetry, understand by monsters? The early Greeks had a small vocabulary for what we call monster. Pelor, a neuter noun, and its derivative peloron, also neuter, occur in Homer and Hesiod, the Homeric hymns to Apollo and Hermes, and other poems. The term connotes physical enormousness, hence the epic adjective pelorios, which can be used of heroes. Teras, etymologically related to pelor, means omen sent by God. For instance, an earthquake or a rainbow, a marvel. In a unique occurrence in Theogony, verse 744, it's not on the handout, Teras refers to the dark, dank space of Tartarus, which, as Hesiod notes, arouses dread even in the gods. Here, Teras seems for the first time to mean monster in our sense, as one of my colleagues, Camilla Zanon, has suggested. Especially, and I add, if Tartarus with its environs, which Hesiod describes in all its haunting details, is conceptualized as a god, a primeval one at that. Tartarus is, after all, the father of Typhoeus by Gaia. In the Homeric hymn to Apollo, verse 303, Teras, qualified as Agrion, so Agrion Teras, refers to the destructive female serpent, Dracaena, killed by Apollo at Delphi. Although our notion of monster is not fundamentally different from that of Homer and Hesiod and later ancient sources, there is one, I think, difference. Unlike the modern monster, Teras and Pelor in archaic sources point to the divine, the numinous. Despite their special role, cosmological monsters are not atypical. I shall try to offer a few tentative definitions, drawing on the vast, monstrously vast bibliography spawned by monster studies. A formative starting point is physiology and its implications. I quote from Fiona Mitchell's book on cosmological and ethnographic monsters, Monsters in Greek Literature, London 2021. Page 1. Monsters' strange bodies mark them out as creatures which fail to fit into the world. They are jarring. I like this adjective, for it points to the surprise and shock produced by a monster. So they are jarring because they do not adhere to categories that govern everyone and everything else. A monster is therefore a physical manifestation of a failure in the expected running of the cosmos. End of quote. Timothy Beale, a Bible expert, sets this insight in the context of the ancient Near East and the Old Testament. I quote him, "Cosmologically, the monstrous is the unheimlich within the house of the world, in biblical theological terms, the order of creation, which undermines confidence in the meaning, integrity, and well-being of the entire cosmos." End of quote. Whether strictly cosmological or not, a monster poses an implicit threat to cosmic order and the social world of which it is a part. Aristotle, though a later source, gives an analogous example of disruption, and this is item 1A on the handout. In his discussion of natural human monsters in the generation of animals, he states that a monstrous birth, a teras, marks a straying or divergence. He uses the verb parek bebeke. So it is a parek vasis, from a species or genos, which, as Mitchell remarked, disrupts and calls in question, on a small scale, eternal, immutable principles of biology. So if I translate it, males take after their father more than their mother, females after their mother. Some take after none of their kindred, although they take after some human being at any rate. Others do not take after a human being at all in their appearance, but have gone so far that they resemble a monstrosity. Tade ut anthropo ten idean al ede terati. And so you can see that anyone, he continues, and for that matter, anyone who does not take after his parents is really, in a way, a monstrosity, since in these cases, nature has, in a way, strayed from parek bebeke, the generic type, and he means the species. As for monstrosities, they are not necessary so far as the purposive or final cause is concerned, the telos. Yet per accidents, now he's getting philosophical, they are necessary since we must take it that their origin at any rate is located here. End of quote. But the important thing is that a monster is a divergence from its species. Deviations from anatomical correctness in the end affirm it, and they generally imply deviations from standards of human morality. There are exceptions. Hesiod's Cyclopes, described explicitly as circle or round-eyed, become Zeus's arms manufacturers, as you know. They are also, if I'm not mistaken, his uncles. The fact that Homeric Cyclops does not resemble his parents, Poseidon and the sea nymph Thousa. This fact puzzled Aristotle and many scholars nowadays. Aristotle fragment 172, it's not on the handout, Rose, asked, in what sense might Polyphemus be a Cyclops, since neither his father nor his mother is one? End of quote. Yet Aristotle was probably the first to define a teras, or a teras, as being that, or a being, an entity that did not resemble its parents, especially his father. He might have also considered Chiron, the son of Cronus, and the Oceanid Philyra, and the centaurs descended from Ixion's son Centauros and a mare. So we mustn't be over-worried over the question why Polyphemus doesn't look like his mum or his dad. Teros, meaning a sign from a god, seems to have given way to teras as a numinous creature. It's almost a metonymy. However nefarious and destructive, monsters have a divine aspect, and some possess a sublimity, even when mortal. For instance, Polyphemus, towering above his fellows like a mountain and terrifying Odysseus and his men with his booming voice, embodies the sublime, the monstrous sublime. Odysseus recalls his first impressions of him. That's book 9, or Rhapsody 9, 190 through 192. That is on the handout, as you can see. Kai gar taum etetukto pelorion ude e oke andrige sitotago alla rio e pulu ende, and so forth. So he was well, I have the Loeb translation, I'm sure you can translate it on your own, but he was a marvel. He was made a marvel to look at. He was a thauma pelorion, and he did not resemble eoke, he did not resemble a bread-eating or wheat-eating or cereal-eating man, but he looked like a rion, which is a mountain peak, right, or a huge crag, well-forested, wooded, among tall mountains, standing out, you see, from other mountain peaks. And the monster imagery in the positive simile that follows, as I said, it's 191 through 2, builds on the hulking scale and physical isolation of the man-monster, and symbolically sets his savagery into sharper relief. The forested peak of high mountains that stands out, that's 191, 192, suggests Polyphemus's exceptional physique and strength compared with that of the other Cyclopes. And perhaps I should remind you, in Book 1 of the Odyssey, verses 70 through 71, he is a sort of king amongst, well, he's the strongest amongst them. He, I think the word is kratos, amongst, I don't think really it refers to governance, but really to his strength amongst his fellow Cyclopes. Polyphemus is sublime according to the criteria of Pseudo-Longinus. The ancient critic notes that we have an unconquerable, I quote, an unconquerable passion for whatever is great and more divine than ourselves. He says this in chapter 35. And goes on to say, and I quote, "So it is by some natural instinct that we admire not the small streams, clear and useful as they are, but the Nile, the Danube, the Rhine, and above all the ocean." End of quote. More than a small fire that we kindle for ourselves, we admire, he says, we admire the fires of heaven. It's not on the handout. And the craters of Etna. That's also in chapter 35. Longinus is, of course, speaking about literary genius. In his words, a consummate author lies, as he says, epano tu thnetu. That's in 36, chapter 36. And in chapter 1, Longinus uses the term ta hyperphua in describing the stunning effect, the electric shock the sublime can produce on an audience. Hyperphua can mean monstrous, prodigious, pelorios, in a good and bad sense. Polyphemus too exceeds mortal bounds, mortal though he is. He too is hyperphues, for his appearance and strength shock normal human beings. But perhaps I'm pressing the sublimity argument too far. I don't know. Well, enough for theory. I'm a practical-minded classicist, hands-on and all that, sort of post-Victorian style. But anyway, ask a Russian, I suppose, or a European 7-year-old to be a monster, to impersonate a monster, and he will oblige, probably with a nod to Disney and the Cookie Monster and other grown-up influences, but what he or she will do may still give us insight into monsters at a universal level. This is how he might evoke a monster. First, he will intone, or she will intone, my nephew has done this, he's been my Versuchsschweinchen, he will intone grrr, right? Baring his imaginary fangs and threatening to eat us up. Two, he will produce a booming, basso profundo cookie monster voice and make inarticulate noises. And three, he will thrust forth his imaginary claws, and generally to try to scare us through his make-believe aggressiveness and malevolence. Now turning to Homer and Hesiod, I shall briefly list some key physical and moral traits of monsters, some of which our young informant acted out. 1. Monsters have prominent teeth, the better to eat us. In general, their oral cavity and appetite spell doom for those unlucky enough to be near them. Scylla, in Odyssey 12, verses 91 and following, has 3 rows of teeth in each of her 6 heads, a total of 18 rows of teeth. And she katesthie, she devoured fish and her human victims, which is interesting because she technically is a composite ketos. She's a ketos and she eats other kete, Homer tells us, or Odysseus tells us. No, it's Homer who tells us. Charybdis, a monstrous vanishing hole in the sea, gulps and regurgitates seawater like a gluttonous throat. That's 12:104 and following. I don't think it's on the handout, but I'm sure you know it, even in translation as children. Cyclops probably has teeth, though Homer does not mention these. We are told that he has a belly that fills up when he too katasthie devours Odysseus's men. That's 9 verse 296. Here, by the way, we detect Homeric, if I may say, censorship or restraint at work. In Theocritus 11, by contrast, the lovelorn adolescent Polyphemus naively advertises his mouth, stoma, in 56, verse 56, with which he hopes to kiss Galatea. In Theocritus 6, verses 37 and 38, he brags about his marble white teeth. It's almost an advertisement for toothpaste. Avant la lettre. Okay? And Virgil, Aeneid 3, 625 through 6, cites Polyphemus's chewing warm joints of human flesh that dangle from his teeth. Oh gosh, I can't do it metrically, I don't think. Vidi atro cum membra fluentia tabor, right? Manderit et tepidi tremeret sub dentibus artus. Manderit from mando, right? Chew. So there it is. Philostratus, Imagines 2, mentions Cyclops' teeth. Connected to a monster's oral cavity are his jaws. Let's not forget the blood-filled thriller, Jaws. I don't know if you've seen it, but anyway, I hope you haven't. Mouth, you won't go swimming in the Pacific if you do. Mouth, teeth, jaws, throat, belly. Indeed, monsters are appetitive creatures. They have appetites. In the Homeric hymn to Apollo, verses 300 and following, the huge female monster serpent Dracaena, Typhon's foster mother, is said to be statrephase, well-fed, or in Martin West's rendering, bloated. She has it. Number 2, monsters make nonsensical sounds that confuse us. Hesiod's Typhoeus emits a jangly but baffling medley of divine and animal voices and a strange hissing. You should look at, I think it's here, yes, it's 829, it's item 3, verses 829 and following. So you can see that he has, in all his dread or dreadful heads, he has voices, you see, and now I think we have the translation on. Actually, it's a very, very functional, workmanlike translation. And there were voices in all his dreadful heads, which uttered every kind of sound unspeakable, For at one time they made sounds such that the gods understood, but at another the noise of a bull, bellowing aloud in proud, ungovernable fury, and at another the sound of a lion, relentless of heart, and at another sounds like whelps, wonderful to hear. And again, at another he would hiss. You see, that's 835. So that the high mountains re-echoed. Hroizesk, you see, hroizesk, he would hiss. Even when subdued by Zeus, Typhoeus continues to emit noises, his squelched voices, his compressed voices, turning into the perpetual howl of squalls, foul winds. 3, related to what I just said, most monsters are physical hybrids. Most, or perhaps I should say many, if not most, are hybrids, or in German, Mischwesen, mixed creatures that mix us up in a cognitive sense by cutting across different species and categories. Besides this, they may also be malformed or deformed. Their deformity consists in either a redundancy through multiplication of anatomical parts, or conversely, a deficiency. They either have too many or too little. 100 heads and just as many or more voices. He says Typhoeus, whom we just looked at. A single eye, a single tooth. Who has a single tooth? The Graii, according to Pherekides, fragment 3. Gigantism, nanism, the opposite, and so on. Either way, deformity is usually combined with extremities of size. As I said, you can compare the classical, and it's classical, it's not archaic Greek, hyperphues, which connotes outrageous scale. Being in whole or in part oddities of morphology and content, monsters are usually ugly or partly beautiful. The Graii, for instance, that's item 4, and the and echidna, they can be partly ugly or partly beautiful, or a combination of both. Just to look at the translation, and again, Cato bore to Phorcys the fair-cheeked, you see, they are kalipareoi, the fair-cheeked Graii, sisters grey from their birth, and both deathless gods and men who walk on earth call them Graii. Pamphredo, well-clad, and saffron-robed, Enyo, and the Gorgons who dwell beyond, they're another set here, of monster. So you can be partly beautiful and partly ugly, combined. Their offence against symmetry and ordinary size makes it hard for people to take them in, if you know what I mean, cognitively. And Aristotle makes this point, not really about monsters, but he says in Poetics, and I don't have that, I don't quote it, but it is item 5, that he implies in his discussion of the apprehension of beauty, to kalon, he says that you need ordinary size and symmetry to be able to take it in cognitively. So their offence against symmetry and ordinary size makes it hard for us to understand them. Number 4, or perhaps before I go on to the 4th point, we can look at, let's see, Echidna. I think she's terribly ugly as well, if you look at the English. She, Cato, bore another monster, you see, Peloron, an unmanageable one, Amekanon, I think that's West's translation. In no way resembling either mortal human beings or the undying gods. So she's really a freak. In a hollow cave, the divine, dauntless Echidna, half a myth, a nymph, I'm sorry, with bright eyes and beautiful cheeks, and again a monstrous Peloron snake. So she's a beautiful woman, but also a monstrous snake, fearful and huge, shimmering, eating raw food. That's very important. She is homestes. She eats raw food. A bit of a cannibal, you might say. So, number 4, their outer ugliness reflects their definitional malevolence, their antisocial character, if they are in contact with human society. Hence they are routinely described as being a kalon pema, a pest, a pestilence, raking evil or evils, kakao, among men, animal and crops. Wreaking evils amongst men, animal and crops. They are pema, kakon pema, and civilized existence in general. But their evil is, I think, social and secondarily theological. Theological in the sense that they oppose, or they may oppose, the governance of Zeus and the Olympian order. But as I said, there are good monsters who uphold the cosmic order. Charon, Kekrops, Proteus, Pegasus, and so forth. Number 5, related to their unusualness, their unusual nature, is their standard non-resemblance, more generally to any kindred category being, whether god, man, beast or animal. As noted, monsters cannot readily be categorized unless a poet tries to insert them into an ontological category. And that's what Homer does in the case of Polyphemus. He calls him a man. He says outright, this is an heir. Their radical physical eccentricity bears out the primary sense of the term teras, an unusual or rare sign, and by extension a rare physical phenomenon serving as an omen. Their unfamiliar aspect, their not being like anything else previously seen, their being dissimilar sometimes even to their parents, serves to remind us that monsters are the other, or the other, capital, uppercase O. And you could say they are vehicles of defamiliarization or stranenie, right? It's one term I learned very many years ago as an undergraduate.
Отстраненность.
Sorry?
Отстраненность. We have two types of...
Right, yes. Very important to us, the Prague and Moscow school. 6. Monsters have an ambivalent metaphysical aspect, which I hinted at and can only touch on. As said, they are, in their original sense, an ill omen, a warning sent by the gods, but especially if compared with their counterparts in other cultures. They may also represent the mystery of God, or the gods, in a grotesque form. And here I'm paraphrasing the theologian Rudolf Otto, his Das Heilige. A monster elicits in man the same reactions as those provoked by the experience of the divine, or the numinous: wonder, vauma, bafflement, fear, awe, deos, even fascination. To get a notion of the sublime, thespesios, overtones of a monster, we might consider the serpentine sea monster Leviathan, known mainly from the book of Job, chapters 40 and 41, dating perhaps to the 7th century BC. And that is on the handout. It's item 6. He, or it, Leviathan, is arguably a chaos monster, or as Harold Bloom suggests, a symbol of the, and I quote, the tyranny of nature over men, end of quote. He is, Leviathan, is at once a violent monster who threatens Yahweh's rule and is therefore destroyed, but also Yahweh's creation and playmate with which he, God, identifies. Because Leviathan sums up many traits of Greek monsters, he is useful to my purposes. Briefly, I list a few. First, Leviathan is an untamable, unassailable hybrid. So if you look at verses 8, 10, and especially 12, let's see, that would be 41:12, if I'm not mistaken, yes. He's unassailable, and in this way, if you verses 8, 10, 12, and 25, in a way he recalls the Homeric chimera, Iliad 6, and that too is on the handout, if I'm not mistaken, a bit farther down. Yes.
On the 5th page, I believe.
Yes, page 5. Yes,
Εκνεκτερών αυτού.
Εκνεκτερών αυτού εκπολούεtai, kapnos kaminu kaiomenes, puri anthrakon. So he has fire coming out of his nostrils. So he does rather look like Chimera, a fire-breathing dragon. Iliad 6, 179, 83. He is indomitable. In other words, you cannot tame him. And he is something of a composite, I think. So he is a bit like Skula, who is called in Odyssey 12, 85, or 86, she's called in Pelor Kakon. Pelor Kakon, that would be 85 and following. We can return to the Leviathan. It's perhaps a bit confusing in the handout because I also have modern Greek translations of it. Okay, so Leviathan is, as I said, uncontrollable. His teeth are terrifying. That should be 41:14. Let's see, 41:14, unless it's not there. Perhaps it's in the English version. Yes, it's in. All this is in the English. I do look perhaps for the benefit of an English-speaking audience. So this is from the English Standard Version, based on King James Version. But anyway, 14, if you look at the English translation, around his teeth is terror. You see, number 14, that's page 7 on the handout. He has flashing eyes and breathes fire, and here I would compare the Dracondes, as I said, and fire spouting Chimera and Tivoeos, who is fiery-eyed and fire-breathing. And most important, if you look at 40, verse 33, let's see, if I have it, or perhaps I don't have that. You don't have it?
Page 8.
Oh, page 8, yes. Thank you. I should put on my glasses, actually. So most important, verse in 40 verse 33, on earth there is not his like, suggests that the creature is unparalleled and beyond description. How might one come to grips with this toothy sea reptile with armoured scales, beautiful proportions, paradoxically, and smoking nostrils? Faced with this visual impossibility, it is an adunaton, the text is here trying to go beyond language, as Timothy Beale remarks. Others say this is a meta-language, but I'll leave that to the theoreticians. This brings me to the main topic of my paper, believe it or not. We're coming to the main topic. And the topic is really the otherness of Homeric and Hesiotic monsters, and the question of how these poetic texts may convey these beings as out of the ordinary and otherworldly. There are several ways, general and particular, to describe a monster in Hesiod and Homer. With the exception of the Odyssey, monsters are treated cursorily, very, very briefly in Homeric poetry, but even here outlandish or unseemly details tend to be airbrushed out. In the Iliad, the treatment is sometimes highly elusive. As a rule, epic descriptions of monsters occur in the direct speech of first-person reminiscence of an event before the point of the story in which we find ourselves. So this is a flashback, an analepsis. Well, in the Iliad, these analepses serve to thrust monsters to more distant times, back to more distant times and places, such as Lycia in the time of Bellerophontes, the speaker's grandfather, in the tale of the Chimera in Iliad 6. In the Odyssey, Odysseus delivers his apologoi, or first-person accounts of monsters in exotic lands. The Theogony's monsters occur in a catalogue performed in the third person. The rule of thumb for Homer and Hesiod and epic poets the world over, I suspect, is, as Maurice Bowrer put it, and I quote, to rely, so the technique, the rule of thumb, their basic technique is to rely on vague horror and undefined dread, end of quote. And, I quote again, to assume that everyone knows what the monster is, and that it therefore needs no description, end of quote, or rather little or no description, I would add. It is striking that the Theogony gives no description of the Gorgons, not even of Medusa, nor of the Sphinx or Hydra. So if you look at verses 3-6 or the Hydra 3:13 and following, no descriptions. Nor does Homer give any physical details about the sirens in Odyssey 12:39 and following. Now, there is a particular idiom in which the Odyssey and the Theogony alike often employ when conjuring not merely monsters but also extraordinary beings and places. Malcolm Davis, in 2 pioneering articles, calls this method description by negation and links it specifically to evocations of the world before creation, of paradise, life on paradise, and miraculous beings and things. What these subjects have in common, what have they in common, is the fact that they represent something not seen before, and therefore hard to conceptualize, which moreover is the antithesis or inversion of the normal. The formal structure used in such description is this: it doesn't, or it isn't, it doesn't have A, it isn't, it doesn't do, it doesn't have B, it isn't, it doesn't do, it doesn't have C, but it is, it does, it has D, That's one possibility. The other is it isn't, it doesn't do, it doesn't have A, but it is, it does, it has B. It isn't, it doesn't do, it doesn't have C. Where the negated terms represent the familiar, which may be desirable or undesirable according to the context, and the climaxing term introduced by the conjunction but is unfamiliar and likewise desirable or undesirable, again, depending on the context. Hesiod uses a variation of this form. Less frequently, the formulation is it isn't, it doesn't do, it doesn't have A, it isn't, doesn't do, doesn't have B, it isn't, doesn't do, doesn't have C, where again A, B and C are positive or negative states or attributes. This structure originated, I suggest, from sacral language cast in the negative about the gods, and was later extended from ritual and more generally to descriptions of otherworldly, especially transcendent subjects. It arguably represents a genre of discourse. Stoic logicians, St. Paul and Neoplatonists such as Iamblichus and Proclus, followed Plato in resorting to such formulations. So did, believe it or not, I'm sure you know it, so also did early church fathers, such as Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory of Nazianzus. The use of the alpha privative, alpha privativum, is about 3% higher in patristic Greek than in classical Greek. Convenient comparanda are the apophatic formulations of Christian theology, meditation, and prayer, through which man, unable to grasp God and paradise, can only state what these are not. Theologians such as Theophilos, Bishop of Antioch, 2nd century, and Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, 6th century, use a proliferation of alpha privatives and other negative expressions to clear away erudite and everyday concepts and categories of God and self. They negate their familiar assumptions and then negate their negations in a regression of negations, striving, as one bishop says, to unknow God and themselves, and thereby achieve mystical union with God. The origins of apophasis go back to Plato, for instance, to his evocation of the world beyond the heavens as seen by gods in ecstasy. Soaring in a parade of winged chariots every 10,000 years, the souls of the gods reach an indescribable, unsingable destination beyond the beyond, and that is on the handout. If I'm not mistaken, it should be. It's Plato Phaedrus.
10, page 10.
Is it page 10? Yes. Thank you. So you will see that the region above the heaven is neither worthily sung, you see, by any earthly poet, nor will it ever be, and so on and so forth. For the colourless, formless, and intangible, truly existing essence with which all true knowledge is concerned holds this region. So this is Phaedrus. Plato, in turn, I propose, drew upon the privative, as I called it, sacral language which Homer and Hesiod appear to be echoing. Even when Homer's negations result in what is formally a positive statement, there still is an undertone of metaphysical or ethnographic aporia, of an effort to stretch language to accommodate the akoreton, the indefinable, that which cannot be accommodated. Well, let's not get lost on the Christian via negativa. Let us consider, for easy instance, Odyssey 4, verses 5, 6, 1 and following, especially 5, 6, 6 through 8, I think that's on the handout. That is number 10, on page 10. And not to do it in Greek, we'll do bits in English. But for yourself, this is Proteus, the shape shifter, a bit monstrous in a way. He predicts the afterlife of Menelaus. But for yourself, Menelaus, it is not ordained by the gods that you should die, but to the Elysian plain and the ends of the earth the gods will convey you. No snow is there, nor heavy storm, nor ever rain, but always, you see, Okeanos sends up blasts of the west wind, and so forth. And if you, and I won't read this, it is still item 10, you can compare pseudo-Basil on paradise. And again, we have strings of negations. So in the description from the Odyssey, just cited, the speaker ironically was moments ago a typical crossbreed monster. That's what I call Proteus. Perhaps I'm taking liberties. For he had transformed himself into 4 animals in succession, for instance, a dracon, or a dracon, and then into water and a tree. He was, however briefly, a composite, a serpent man, knowledgeable about the depths of the sea and the future. He is willing to prophesy to Menelaus. So he's an obliging monster, so long as you twist his arm, as it were. Is this the time for the break? No. No.
25 minutes.
Oh, okay, good. Because
Including discussion.
Yes, we're going to have discussion, yes. So I turn to the Theogony, dear friends. In the longer descriptions of monsters, such as my favourite, Typhoeus, the Hesiotic text does not resort to strings of negative statements, though it does use a series of negative sentences when describing the life of the golden generation in Works and Days, 114 and 111 through 114. But we don't really have long strings. I don't think, well, we do have some negative statements in the Theogony, but not as much, I don't think, as in the Odyssey. In its vignettes of monsters, the Theogony generally uses one or more adjectives prefixed with a privative alpha or an equivalent negative expression. A few examples, if we can return to Echidna, that's Theogony 295 through 305. Echidna ultimately descended from the monstrous family tree of Pontos, is the most prolific, promiscuous member of Hesiod's self-enclosed serpentarium. The daughter of Cato, and what does Cato mean? It means female sea monster, and Phorcus. She is the mother of 6 snake-like monsters, 2 of them through incest. Born in a cave, she subsequently lives in one, perhaps the same one, in a mountainous region. Is it in Asia Minor or Italy? West doesn't really help us here. But anyway, here is Hesiod's description. So if you go back to Cato, to Echidna, I forgot which item it is, but it's Theogony 295 and following. I'll just do it in English. She, Cato, bore another monster, Peloron, an unmanageable one, Amekanon, in no way resembling either mortal human beings or the undying gods. That's it, thank you, I'm sorry. And she did all this in a hollow cave, the divine, dauntless Echidna. Half a nymph with bright eyes and beautiful cheeks, a pretty young thing. Half again, a monstrous peleron snake, fearful and huge, shimmering Ioannis, eating raw food, or mestain, under the hidden places of the holy earth. There she has a cave, deep down under a hollow boulder, far from the undying gods and mortal human beings and so forth. She keeps guard among the arimoi, under the earth, baleful echidna, an immortal nymph, and unaging all her days. See, Petropoulos. Well, this paradoxical mongrel, beautiful nymph and huge snake, is introduced through two negatives, making her amekanos, and unlike any other being, god or man or beast, she defies classification and description. Her hybrid nature is brought out by her Ioannis appearance. She shifts colours and shades just as Proteus shifts shapes, and Typhoeus voices and shapes. She eats raw meat, even human flesh. Does she chew her victims like Virgil's Polyphemus, or gulp them down like Polyphemus in Homer and Hannibal Lecter? Come to think of it, which half of her eats food, raw food? Daniel Ogden, in this fabulous book, it's a compendium on Dracon, Oxford University published about 10 years ago, he speculates that she has one or more snake heads, up to 100, on her lower serpent half. So it is possible that she consumes men from this end. However that may be, Echidna is, thank goodness, far, far away, yet ever lurking in a cave under a rock. Immortal monsters, and Hesiod stresses Echidna's eternal youth, are sometimes poised to resurface and haunt civilization. Now for her son. I think that is on the handout as well. It's Theogony 3:10 through 12. Maybe one of the earlier.
Number 11.
Is it 11? Thank you. Yes. Okay. Then again, she, Echidna, bore by Typhoeus a second offspring, one unmanageable, again, amekanon, not to be spoken, uti phateon, Cerberus, or Cerberus, the eater of raw fish, the brazen-voiced, halkeophonon, hound of Hades, 50-headed, shameless, unidea, you see, unidea, and mighty. Again, negatives introduce, they usher in a monster. Cerberus is defined by a privative adjective, amekanos, or amekanon, intractable, unmanageable, and a further negation, unspeakable, in fact, unpronounceable. The snaky dog's very name is an abomination and should not be uttered for fear of polluting the audience. At a later stage, as others have argued, unspeakable may have less ominously connoted indescribably, exceeding human speech. Cerberus's bark is as unerodable as bronze. In Homer, bronze is said to be ateres, unerodable. So the epithet brazen voice serves in effect as a negative term, suggesting an inexhaustible and at the same time penetrating sound. This is something a colleague has argued, I think Andrew Ford of Princeton. More than that, this powerful clanging sound is assumed to be incomprehensible, Hesiod deals in vague horror, hinting at the polluting otherness of the hound through negatives among which we might include, as I said, brazen-voiced. The poet leaves the only visual detail, the 50 heads, to the imagination of you, the audience. How do these heads look? Are they serpentine, given that his parents are the Dracondes, Echidna and Typhoeus? What about his teeth? The dog has teeth, and Cerberus Omestes, 311, shares with other monsters, such as his mother and Polyphemus, an appetite for uncooked human flesh, which the poet confirms in verse 773. It's not on the handout, where the clever hound esthie those trying to escape from Hades. Cerberus behaves like the Iliad's dogs, which feed on the carrion, the dead bodies, the corpses of warriors after a battle. Then if we can look at item 12, it's Theogony 147 and following. And again, there were born of earth and heaven, Uranos, 3 more sons, mighty and stern, not to be spoken of. Not to be spoken of. Now, uk onomastoi, overbearing children. Hyper fialoi, hyper and fiale, a vessel, sort of over the top, spilling over the top. 100 arms sprang from their shoulders, unshapen hulks. That's West's translation, and it makes sense. Unshapen hulks. Aplastoi, from Plasto, Plato, I think would be, from Plato or Plasso. And 50 heads grew from the shoulders of each of them upon their stalwart bodies. And strength boundless, apletos, that's also his rendition, strength boundless and powerful was upon their mighty form. What you notice here, 2 alpha privative adjectives and a negative paraphrase, uk onomastoi, feature in the description of these 3 entities and their forbidding misshapen physique, if that's what aplastoi means, sort of hulking, misshapen. But why are they unmentionable when in fact the poet lists their names? Penelope, he does list their names, if you notice, 148 and following. Their names are Kotos, Briarios, and Guges. So, what's happening here? Well, Penelope, and this is not my original idea, but Penelope in Odyssey 19, verse 260, it's not on the handout, and elsewhere uses the phrase kako ilion uk onomastein. Yet she too has mentioned Ilium, or Ilios, which she treats as something of a monster. Perhaps the phrase here, and in many other instances, including the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, verse 253, perhaps it means cursed, having an ill-omened name, the equivalent to dysonymos, but forgive me, this is just my guess. Well, in the Apologoi, Odysseus uses a series of negations to describe the inversions in the lifestyle of a race of monsters, the Kyklopes, and that is on the handout. It's 13, 105 and following. Trusting in the immortal gods, they, the Kyklops, or the Kyklopes, plant nothing. Notice that. They plant nothing. U phuteusin. And they do not plough. Ut aroosin. But all these things, crops, sprout, they grow without sowing or ploughing. Isn't that interesting? Asparta, you see, kai anerota. Wheat and barley and vines. Then a bit further on, neither assemblies for council have they, nor appointed laws. Right. Where would that be? Can you see? Bulai? On the next page. Agorai, yes, thank you. So they don't have assemblies for council, Bulai, nor have they appointed laws. Themistus? Right, ute themistus. Yes, thank you. Agorai, buleporoi, ute themistus. But they dwell on the peaks of mountains, blah, 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 blah. And each lays down the law for his children and wives, and they have no care for one another, you see. Uk alelon alegusin. Well, here the language about gods and the miraculous has been appropriated by ethnographic discourse. Odysseus has turned a foreign race or society into monsters. Their deformity is not only physiological, but also social. The Kyklopes hark forward to the racial or ethnic monsters of later Greek and Latin ethnography, amounting to some 40 races, such as the Kynocephaloi of India and the Macrocephaloi in Scythia. Polyphemus, emphatically human in the Odyssey, eats human beings raw. This equates him, as said, with the bestial status of Cerberus or Cerberus. Despite his human nature, the Cyclops or the Kyklopes is not hard to define. Consider these verses from Odyssey 9. It's 187 through 92. Thank you, that's 16. You can see that there in the cave a monstrous man, Aner Pelorios, spent his nights, who shepherded his flocks alone and afar, and did not mingle with others, but lived apart, knowing no law. For he was a monstrous marvel, Thauma, and so forth, and was not like a bread-eating man, but like a wooded peak of high mountains, which is prominent, and so forth. Apophatic structure is employed to show what an eccentric being he is. And I think there's a touch of black humour here in the statement. He did not resemble a bread-eating man, inasmuch as the epithet bread-eating plays on the Homeric epithet man-eating. So it's very bleak and black humour. Cannibalism, eating, esthene, or edain, your own kind, allelophagia, which is a Herodotean term, is first attested in the West in Homer and Hesiod as a supremely antisocial private act. Unlike cannibalism as attested in societies such as 16th century Brazil and elsewhere, the phenomenon in Homer is the ne plus ultra of antisocial acts, worse even than the hubris of the mutilation of a corpse, for it compounds murder with figurative incest, alimentary incest, as Claude Lévi-Strauss calls it, besides condemning the victim's body to mutilation in the cannibal's mouth and intestines. The Iliad, in its relative avoidance of monsters and outrageously gruesome acts, omits cannibalism, or outright cannibalism, limiting it to similes, descriptions, macabre forecasts and promises involving carrion animals and fishes, and fantasies of wish fulfillment. So what does Polyphemus do? In the end, he carries out the extreme fantasy of many an Iliadic hero. Perhaps I should end here, or yes? So, yeah. So this brings me back to monsters in general. The extent that a monster can be defined, or to the extent that a monster can be defined at all, Homer and Hesiod show that it is easier to define something abominable by stating what it is not. A negative formulation is by the same account suitable for the description of something sublime, something out of this world, in a positive sense, or an ethnographically non-normal sense. So the language of abomination and monstrosity overlaps the idiom of wonder and admiration. So I'll end there.
So probably some questions in Russian, English, or
Any language.
modern Greek.
Portuguese.
Да, профессор Petropoulos призывает даже по-португальски спрашивать. Да, пожалуйста.
Я, наверное, по-английски не смогу задать. Вот, по-русски скажу. Если боги, если монстры и чудовища в целом описываются в источниках как нечто невразумительное, то, что нельзя представить, и вроде как с негативным контекстом, людям отвратительное по природе своей, антикосмическое, то какова природа чудовищ, которые были упомянуты, которые дружелюбно настроены к людям, тот же самый Пегас и так далее.
If the monsters are described generally as something not friendly for humans and having negative characteristics, how are described characteristics of such monsters which are mentioned having a friendly character as Pegasus, for example?
Mm-hmm. How are they described?
Yes.
Well, they're not, I don't think, they're not described apophatically, they're not described negatively, these good monsters, as far as I recall. Chiron, or Pegasus,
Вы поняли.
I don't think that, I can't think offhand.
Они не описываются апофатически. И помимо Пегаса сюда входит еще Херон.
Is Chiron apophatically described? I don't think so. He's called a fair, a Thea or fair, the Ionic version. I don't think so. I can't. I wouldn't swear to it. I have to look at descriptions of Pegasus, but in Theogony, Pegasus is, I don't think, described negatively. No.
And if they are not negatively described, so why their nature are friendly towards humans or gods? Why they're friendly and others are hostile?
No.
On your opinion, of course.
Well, let's go back to the Theogony. Kyklopes, the three Kyklopes, and the three Ekatoncheres, they're friends of Zeus. They're allies, very staunch allies. So, and yet they're defined negatively. So there we have good monsters. But perhaps originally they were really nasty, bad, and somehow they were converted by tradition, I don't know, and sort of rechristened, good, turned into good monsters. But they started as inimical, hateful, cosmic beings. That may be it. It's only a guess, but they're something extraordinary, you see.
Some more questions?
У меня на самом деле еще один есть, если можно.
It's the second question from the same student.
Ну, вот я, наверное, на русский лучше скажу. Можно ли утверждать, это, наверное, все-таки больше не филологический вопрос, а антропологический и, наверное, более этнографический вопрос. Можно ли утверждать, что эти монстры, которые недружелюбны к людям, изначально в родоплеменном диком обществе могли олицетворять нечто природное и негативное, что могло навредить людям, то есть как внешнюю окружающую враждебную среду? То есть могут ли это быть какие-то реминисценции с того времени, как персонификации?
Someone called me, so.
The question is, could it be stated that those hostile monsters are personifications of evil natural phenomena which are somehow tending to be preserved in newer time from the primitive society. So when in primitive society, negative characteristics of weather, for example, could be personified as monsters.
Yes. Yeah.
You think it's possible?
Oh yes.
It's possible.
Yes. Negative terms. Yes. Yeah. Or negative emotions, human emotions. I think really, for instance, Kronos introduces the element of thonos. So it's almost introducing evil into the cosmos. It almost sounds Old Testament-like, you see. He's the beginning of evil, sets the precedent. And the Titans are fallen angels, you see. So negative entities, ideas, natural forces are turned into monsters, yes. Yeah. But having said that, and I'm not really well read in Zizek, I don't know if you it's a bit beyond my level, but he says that, and he's really copying the book of Job, God is a monster. So you have this supreme, ne plus ultra, and it's monstrous. He is monstrous, this entity. It exceeds you. So, it can be something purely negative in terms of natural forces, but also emotions, as I said, thonos, antisocial emotions. But it can be something positive in a way, like God. And God, in fact, according to Job, identifies with this creature, Leviathan, and yet can overpower him.
So allow me for perhaps one question. Thank you, first of all, for your lecture. He is, I think, exhaustive.
Exhausting, I hope not.
Yes.
No, yeah.
Exhausting of this topic. My question is it possible to make a differentiation between creatures which are material and which are immaterial? I think supernatural. Is it possible to trace in our texts some difference? So is it something like crocodile or something like ghost?
Or immaterial, entirely.
Yes.
Sort of, yes.
So are there references, for example, to material material of from what they consist, so flesh or something else, or is it not possible to distinguish?
Yeah, I think on the whole, it's a monster will be physical, and will be somewhere ready to leap out and create havoc. Yes, but you have, well, I don't know if they're monsters, but you have the sirens, who are immaterial. They're just pure voice, just voice. You see.
Unlike the harpies.
And the harpies, yes. Well, yeah. But I you know, yes, the harpies, the elineurs, they tend to be physical, right? They can manifest themselves. So, I don't think you get a lot of ghosts. Later, you get ghost stories, of course, in antiquity. Ghost stories, yes, and ghosts can, Lucian has a collection of ghost stories, right?
But they are in this writer not in the same terms as Peloria.
Yeah, they're not. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, yeah, I think Pelor by definition is huge. And
huge, but material.
But material, yes. I mean, Cyclops is material, and he's a materialist. He likes his raw food. Yeah.
Any more questions? So, Professor Samoilenko
In Greek.
In modern Greek.
Modern Greek.
Για την καλοκαγαθία ήθελα να...
Καλοκαγαθία.
Μήπως είναι ένα είδος της... μια προέκταση αναχρονιστική, μια προσπάθεια να εξοραϊστεί το τερατόμορφο. Κατά πόσο μπορούμε να το θεωρήσουμε ανταγωνιστικό των τεράτων των πανάρχων.
Η
καλός και αγαθός. Ναι, η ιδέα αυτή που είναι όψιμη από ό,τι καταλαβαίνω.
Ναι, κλασική από την κλασική εποχή.
Μήπως είναι ένα τέρας, μια τερατώδης υπόσταση εκεί.
Μα δεν είναι συμφυρμός, είναι συνδυασμός δύο θετικών στοιχείων. Καλός και αγαθός.
Ναι, το ξέρω, αλλά λέω μήπως μπορούμε να το δούμε σαν μια προέκταση αυτού του μόνστρου. Γιατί βλέπουμε ότι και τα τέρατα είναι ωραία κατά κάποιο τρόπο. Δεν έχουμε... Мы не видим никаких эпитетов, которые означали бы там отвратительный, мерзкий, вот такой вот какой-нибудь гнусный. И в связи с этим вот эпитет лигрос все-таки, он с чем имеет связь, да? Вопрос. То есть вроде бы нет эпитетов, которые именно описывали бы отвращение, вызываемое у человека. Страх, ужас там, и так далее, пожалуйста. Но не отвращение, не омерзение. Вот. И в этом смысле, может быть, колокагатия это позже, которая появляется, она тоже какая-то вот, вот эта исключительность достигаемая, она может быть тоже такая.
So Kalokagathia as an opposite side of the same phenomenon, as a mirror of sense.
Δεν βλέπουμε επίθετα για τα τέρατα αυτά μέσα σε αυτά τα κείμενα που να δείχνουν την απέξια, την...
I'll tell you of a person who is kalos Agathos, I think it is Socrates. And he looks like a Silenus, doesn't he, according to the symposium. He's ugly on the outside, but good on the inside. I don't know, perhaps he's a Teras. Ο Σοκράτης.
Ο Σοκράτης πάντα εικονίζεται σαν απέσιο.
Σαν να είναι Σιλινός. Έτσι τον περιγράφει ο Αλκιβιάδης στο τέλος του συμποσίου του Πλάτωνος. Είναι δύσμορφος, είναι άσχημος, αλλά είναι...
όχι αποκρουστικός.
Όχι, αλλά λέει ότι μοιάζει με Σιλινό, νομίζω.
Μοιάζει, αλλά δεν έχει...
Αποκρουστικός όχι, ούτε...
Απεχθής δεν είναι.
Απεχθής όχι, ούτε σιχαλέρος. Ναι, αλλά είναι καλός και αγαθός, είναι άσχημος, είναι hybrid. Αλλά είναι ωραίο αυτό που λέτε, η αντανάκλαση.
Το έκτακτο, δηλαδή ο έκτακτος χαρακτήρας, δηλαδή το μη συνηθισμένο της καλοπραγραφίας, όπως έκτακτο και το του τερατώδους.
Ναι. Είναι ενδιαφέρον αυτό, ναι. Το μυαλό μου πάει μόνο στον Σοκράτη, αλλά και ευχαριστώ για αυτή τη σκέψη σας, ο Σοκράτης.
Ή μήπως αυτό είναι ένας αναχρονισμός, να το θέσουμε έτσι το θέμα, δεν έχουμε δικαίωμα να θέσουμε.
Ναι. Αναχρονισμός ότι ο καλός χαρακτήρας...
Ότι άλλη εποχή που γέννησε αυτά τα τέρατα στη συνείδηση των ποιητών.
Ναι.
Και άλλη εποχή του Σοκράτους και του Πλάτωνος, που αυτή η ιδέα του καλού και αγαθού ταυτόχρονα είναι μια κοινωνική ιδέα, μια πολιτική ιδέα κτλ. Είναι αναχρονισμός ή έχει κάποια συνέχεια σαν ιδέα?
Αυτές οι όμορφες και πανάσχημες, ας πούμε, υπάρξεις, οι ιδρέες, ας πούμε,
καλυπάρες.
Ναι.
Μήπως αυτή η ιδέα προϋπήρχε από τότε στην ελληνική συνείδηση?
Ναι, αλλά καλός καγαθός είναι και ηθική, είναι πρωτίστως ηθική άποψη. Λίγο πολύ σημαίνει gentleman.
Και τα γυμναστήρια.
Αυτός είναι αναχρονισμός.
Τα γυμναστήρια έχει και ηλική.
Ναι. Δεν νομίζω ότι το είχαν εκλεπτύνει τόσο πολύ στην αρχαϊκή.
Μπορεί να μην το είχαν συνειδητοποιήσει, εκτός από τον Πλάτωνα.
Ναι. Αλλά και ο Πλάτων περιγράφει την ανθρώπινη ψυχή ως τέρας, έτσι δεν είναι, ως υβρίδιο. Έτσι δεν είναι. The human soul, he says, is right? It's a lion, it has the leondodes, right? And then it has what? It has the thymoides, right? Which is a different animal, right? So it's a three-piece animal, the human soul.
Well, I'm afraid we are slightly out of schedule. Коллеги, если кто-то еще не сформулировал своего вопроса, теоретически вы можете его, наверное, записать и передать профессору Petropoulos. Вот, что же, тогда мы все-таки, чтобы был некоторый отдых, давайте сделаем перерыв минут на 10, да, через 10 начнем вторую лекцию. Сейчас давайте еще раз поблагодарим профессора. Так, уважаемые коллеги, началась наша вторая лекция профессора Petropoulosa. И, как вы знаете из наших объявлений, она посвящена другой проблеме, другой эпохе. И называется «Педагогический трактат Плутарха de audiendis poetis». Так. Ага, и трактат Василия Великого
De legendis gentilium libris.
De legendis gentilium libris.
Yes, oh, exactly. Yes, thank you. Well, welcome to part 2, and thank you for your patience and your stamina. I forgot to tell you that I'm going to send to Professor Solopov a bibliography, a very, very basic bibliography for both talks. So, anyway, well, my subject is really Plutarch and his essay. It's an essay, it's not a dialogue, a long essay, one of the Moralia, part of the Moralia. The texts are taken from Perseus online, but I have cheated a bit. I've changed them in the light of Hunter's and Russell's edition. It's a 2010 edition, Cambridge University Press. It's the so-called green and yellow books. I'm sure you know them, you use them. And the translation is Perseus, except where I have modified it and stated. So, it's possibles. Well, I can take it. Okay, so the essay is addressed to a Marcus Sedatus, a friend who, like the author, has a teenage boy. In school both boys hear, and the verb in Greek is akrasthai, and read anagignoskein, poetry, the main subject of the ancient primary and secondary level curriculum.
The bottle.
Oh, the bottle is, yes. Sorry, yes. And by the way, akrasthai and anagignoskein are basically synonymous because, as you know, reading was an oral procedure. Now, using a wide range of texts, actually a range of excerpts, drawn from poetry, Plutarch sets out to suggest strategies in which a father or teacher can guide his son when reading texts as diverse as Homer tragedy and comedy. The young man must be trained to detect what is morally useful, and he uses the term kresimon, and beneficial, soterion, in an author. That's what Plutarch says in the beginning of the work, in the introduction. Plutarch's didactic view of literature, his expectation that poets were teachers of moral virtue, was highly conventional. It was almost cliché, and was shared by educators throughout antiquity. But schoolmasters and intellectuals alike always had to confront the embarrassing conduct of the gods, especially in Homer. Xenophanes and Plato, for instance, found some of the gods' behavior reprehensible, morally odious. In similar fashion, early Christian readers of the Old Testament were troubled by the many marriages of certain patriarchs. But, to return to Plutarch, his essay is not an outline of utopian education, but rather offers practical instruction in the sophisticated use of grammar, vocabulary, context, and other considerations. So really, he lays down ways to use grammar to salvage the literal meaning, to make it morally beneficial or morally well, certainly not harmful. This instruction is in the form of comments on an anthology of excerpts from ancient poets taught in school. So it's really a series of excerpts, and then the excerpts are sandwiched between his comments, how to deal with this, how to deal with that. The premise of the essay is that the reading of literature leads to character building, but it is character building that will equip a young man to move on in his studies to philosophy. That is the ultimate goal. It is a propaideia for philosophy, as he says. Plutarch envisages an interdisciplinary study of poetry when he encourages the teacher to gently introduce tenets, ideas, principles of moral philosophy during the classroom exposition of poets. So very gently get some, not theology, but get some philosophy into the class. Such cross-disciplinarity goes back to Socrates. For the latter, and I quote Stephen Halliwell, is ready to cite poetic material in considering philosophical matters, end of quote. For instance, in the Apology. Cleanthes, the head of the Stoic school in the late 4th century BC, wrote a Petropoulos di ton poimaton akouin. It's very much like Plutarch's title in Greek. And he also wrote, Cleanthes, a work titled On Poems. I think it's poimaton. He used poetic quotation in both treatises as a starting point, a springboard, aphorme, for philosophical inquiry. Plutarch used the respected texts of poets as preliminary training in philosophy for another reason, which also goes back to Plato. In the Republic, you may remember, the philosopher advocated a two-level, two-tiered system of education, which provided for initial training based on doxa, right, and culminating in education resting on episteme. The Republic's future guardians, the phylaces, advanced from largely literary studies which built moral character to philosophical education. So you can see Plutarch is pretty much doing the same. Plutarch, a middle Platonist, was quite eclectic. Much of the essay's interest lies in the way he follows Plato and especially Aristotle in interpreting poetry. So he was not a dogmatic Platonist, hard style, old style. He fished around, he shopped around for ideas. Aristotle, the Stoa, and so forth. Throughout the work, we hear echoes of Plato's Republic, books 2 and 3 on mimesis, and 10, mimesis and the attack on all the arts. Even several of the Homeric passages he selects are also discussed in the Republic. Peripatetic thinking generally influenced the ancient Homeric scholiasts. Plutarch's literary criticism, therefore, often invites comparison with the Scholia Minora, which largely reflect the concerns of the classroom. Aristotle's more open attitude to poetry prevails in this rather rambling essay, as I call it. More liberally minded than Plato, Aristotle depoliticized tragedy and saw it as a healthy art form, on the grounds that the emotional upheaval and questioning it provoked were beneficial. His theory of catharsis, for instance. It is largely thanks to the influence of Aristotle that until late antiquity, pagan schoolmasters and commentators continued to uphold the educational benefits of Homer and literature in general. Plutarch was one such pagan. St. Basil the Greek, and that is the topic of tomorrow's talk, St. Basil the Greek may have relied on Plutarch, or his sources, or both, and by countless removes on Aristotle, when he wrote his influential homilia on the pedagogical benefits of reading the Greek classics. And by Greek he meant pagan classics. Pros tus neus hopos an ex Hellenikon opheloindo logon. Although the verbatim similarities between Basil's Logos and Plutarch's essays are very few. Hunter and Russell, however, suggest that St. Basil has been influenced by Plato's work, and I must agree. Apart from three overlaps with Plutarch, which they note but which are educational loci communis, the points of contact are broader and more diffuse. Just as Plato, St. Basil comments on a number of school text excerpts and treats the conventional curriculum as a propaideia for more sublime pursuits. Both Plutarch and St. Basil uphold, they defend an openness to poetry. They do not espouse Plato's censorship or Bowdlerization. It's expurgation, expurgatio, which is different from censorship. So they don't want either. Their central message, if it can be put in a nutshell, is that a young person should be trained to read critically, with a view to moral improvement. Plutarch, in particular, shows how the educated classes, the elite, you might say, read poetry, especially Homer, the poet par excellence. He gives us examples of the moral problematization of poetry and the solutions, the luces, devised for the classroom. To postmodern readers like ourselves, his essay, like St. Basil's work, is a chapter in the reception of ancient poetry and a late antique case study of reader response. Plutarch, one might feel, is often guilty, as I said, of macrologia, which is partly to do with his profuse reliance on images and similes in his arguments. His style is neoclassical, without the excesses of the Atticists. He avoids hiatus, and the editors, Hunter and Russell, show that he uses complicated patterns of clausulae, or cola, as we call them. His excerpts from Homer outnumber those of other authors because, why? Because this poet, even 5 centuries after Plato's time, continued to be the major author, taught at all levels in school. Plutarch also preserves a large number of tragic and comic fragments. So he's very interesting. He's a sort of treasure trove of citations. So let's look at the very first one. It's 15 BC, B through C, and it is, and there's, I hope I have the translation, or maybe not. Yes, I do have the translation, but he cites, as you can see, and all citations I've indicated by through italics. So, Pelopoulos kephaleini men kakon ende estlon. So, in the, what is it? In the head of the cuttlefish may be found bad. Good there is also, you might say. So, any is from NSD, right? And then he says you can have dinner, or a sort of meze, a little snack of cuttlefish, and you'll get indigestion and also bad dreams. But it's delicious. And I agree. I don't know about the dreams, but anyway. Then he goes on, apropos of things that are good and bad, in turns, he quotes a line from Odyssey 4. Pharmaca, do you see that? Pharmaca pola men esla memigmena pola de lugra tois chromenes anadidosi. I don't know if that the last three words are part of the. They must be. Yes, they're part of the Homeric text. So drugs, and some are good when mixed, and others baneful. Baneful. Well, I think Homer is up to Lugra. Goes up to Lugra, right? So his point is that poetry can be good for you, or it can create a sort of indigestion, and so the first verse, perhaps I didn't do justice to it. It is Polypodos kephalei eni men kakon en de kai esthlon. So that is an anonymous hexameter, and it became proverbial. And so what is he talking about? He's talking about intellectual food, right? So beware, be careful. And this is from the very beginning of his essay. Then 15d, this is also very interesting. I'll read the bit in bold. Avoid poetry. Shall we? No, this is a good question. It's a rhetorical question. Shall we then stop the ears, plug up the ears of the young, as those of the Ithacans were stopped with a hard and unyielding wax, and force them to put to sea in the Epicurean boat, and avoid poetry and steer their course clear of it? Or rather, shall we set them against some upright standard of reason, and there bind them fast, guiding and guarding their judgment? So you see, a good teacher or a good parent will guide, he will be a sort of captain, but he won't forbid his student, his son, to listen to poetry or to read poetry. So we shan't be like the Epicureans, who were very dismissive of poetry and of grammarians, right? Because they said grammarians or poets, or both actually, contradict themselves all the time. And St. Basil, and that is number 4, I think. Yes, he makes the same point, I think. Well, no, not really. I take that back. He uses the same image, and it was almost a locus communis of the dangers, the temptations of the silence. The Stoics used it of sensual pleasure, and it became an educational topos, and it's also echoed in the in the scholia, which have an educational slant, so in the didactic scholia. But St. Basil says that when it comes to imitating, to the mimesis of evil, unworthy men, mochterus andras, tein memesin tautein de theogein, right? You must avoid this sort of mimesis. So this sort of poetry you must stay away from. And other church fathers used this. They were very, very, everyone used the image of the tempting sirens. Clement Alexandrinus, or Clement of Alexandria, uses it in his Protreptikos. He says, fellow passengers, I don't think it's on the handout, let us avoid this sea wave the island is evil, and he calls it ponira nesos, littered with bones and corpses. Here is a pornidion horaion, hedone. And this pornidion is enjoying popular music. Pandemos musicae. So he says paraple, imperative, sail away from this ordain, this popular music, which is sensual and really is a siren, or does what the sirens do to us. So anyway, if you go back, I'm sorry, I'm skipping about, but if you go back to Odyssey 12, Mu Rhapsody, well, what is it about? It does sound as though Homer, the Odyssey, is talking about the nature and power of poetry. And the song of the sirens, according to many classicists, is really dangerous anti-epic, right? It's a different tradition of music, and you must steer clear of it. But, again, as I said, Plutarch, to his credit, is not like St. Basil. He doesn't say, be deaf to it. But he says, listen to it, but with discretion. Don't be like the Epicureans. Of course, St. Basil was still in the future, but he said, don't listen to the Epicureans. Listen to music, but what you should do is, and he uses the verb or the imperatives, phogein, flee from it, and kai par exe launein, which is actually taken from Homer. It's from Odyssey 12, to row past and away from the sirens. And what you should do is orthotini logismo paristandes, I think it's tonneon, so sort of placing the young man next to rationality. Ortho logismo kai katadeondes tein krisi. Tie up, not simply tie, but tie very to tie fast his krisis, right? Hopos me paraferite feritai to terpondi prostovlaton. And so what we should do after tying our student's mind to the mast of rationality, we should apethinomen, right? This is a protrope. It's a sort of, I think, protractic or jussive subjunctive. Let's guide him like good captains, and paraphylatomen. Let's guard him, right? So that is from the very beginning. You can tell, in other words, that he's going to be rather discerning and very, very open-minded about poetry. Okay. And I'm sure you can tell me about Seneca and Horace. They discuss the sirens and so forth. But so it's a sort of proverbial allusion to temptation. Anyway. But what is interesting again about Plutarch is that he is in tune with the positive strand of interpretation. Listen to them. Listen to them like Odysseus. Don't sail away. Okay, now 15F, that's number 5 on page 3. So he's talking about the vine of poetry. He's very fond of images, as I said. He's talking about the vine of poetry. And he uses, I think, the term ambelos or something like that. And he says, but so let us not root up or destroy the muse's vine of poetry, but where the mythical and dramatic part grows all riotous and luxuriant through pleasure unalloyed, which gives it boldness and obstinacy in seeking acclaim, let us take it in hand and prune it and pinch it back. So poetry, the muses have a vine. I think he calls it, it's a bit further, it's a bit earlier, it's climatis, I think it's climatis, so it's a vine. So take it, prune it, cut it up. But where, with its grace, it approaches a true kind of culture, and the sweet allurement of its language is not fruitless or vacuous, there let us introduce philosophy and blend it with poetry. For just as the mandragora or the mandragora, when it grows beside the vine, it's a kind of plant, beside the vine and imparts its influence to the wine, makes this weigh less heavily on those who drink it. So poetry, by taking up its themes from philosophy and blending them with fable, renders the task of learning light and agreeable for the young. So mix, you can make a little discrete mixture of poetry with philosophy, and it makes learning light and agreeable for the young. Wherefore, or therefore, poetry should not be avoided by those who are intending to pursue philosophy, but they should use poetry as an introductory exercise. And the term he uses is, what is the term? Prophilosophitheon. En poemasin prophilosophitheon ethisomenus en to terpondi to kresimon zetein kai agapan. So you must use philosophy in your pursuit of to kresimon, what is morally useful. So this passage rests on a simile, moral philosophy, and he's talking about moral philosophy. Okay, he's not doing any other type of philosophy. Moral philosophy planted alongside poetry has a beneficial effect. Then 16 AC, that's number 6 on page 3. He says, he quotes a proverb, or it may be a cliche. Of course, it goes back to Hesiod and the Odyssey. Many the lies poets tell, and it's also repeated in Solon, I think. So many the lies the poets tell, some intentionally, some unintentionally. Isn't that interesting? So he says, in Greek, pola pseudondai a oidoi, tamen hecondes ta de acondes. So they lie, but when they lie on purpose, intentionally, they do so for the purpose of giving pleasure and gratification to the ear, and this is what most people look for in poetry. And a little further down, for the truth, because it is what actually happens, does not deviate from its course, even though the end may be unpleasant. Whereas fiction, notice, fiction being a verbal fabrication, very readily follows a roundabout route and turns aside from the painful to what is more pleasant. For not metre, nor figure of speech, nor loftiness of diction, nor aptness of metaphor, nor unity of composition has so much allurement and charm as a clever interweaving of fabulous narrative. But just as in pictures colour is more stimulating because it is lifelike and creates an illusion, so in poetry falsehood combined with plausibility, I think it's topithanon, is more striking and gives more satisfaction than the stylistic elaboration of rhythm and language which lacks mythical or fictional elements. So what is he saying here? If you say a lot of false things, and you say them with a degree of plausibility, they sound convincing, that is much better than the best of meter, the best of metaphors, and so forth. Lying. Poetry is lying. You've heard this before, right? Poets lie. Poetry is falsehood. Pseudos, or pseudos, in Plato means falsehood, but it also means fiction. And here he uses the term to platomenon, Plato, with two tau, or two sigma. Platomenon is what you manufacture, you mold. The first thing a pupil must learn then, or when he should know, is that poetry is full of lies, lies that sound convincing. And have you read perhaps Hesiod, the Theogony, the so-called introductory Dichterweihe, right? That's the scene of introduction. It's verse 27. The Muses tell this very humble shepherd, "We know to tell many lies that sound like truth," right? But they hasten to add in the next verse that they also recount true things, right? I think it's etetuma. We also tell the truths when we like, you see. So they're capricious. And then Odyssey 19, Odysseus mentions Cretan lies which sound like truth, but they're very plausible. So, also for Plutarch, poetry is ambiguous. Remember? It's a cuttlefish, this delicious fish, and young readers must have this ingrained in them. They must learn, and he uses the term memeletemenon. It has to be pressed into their mind. He is, after all, a Platonist in this. And you know Plato, I'm sure, better than I do. He, I think he suspects, and I cite Halliwell in his introduction to Republic 10. Poetry, I'm quoting Halliwell, poetry and other art may be prepared to sacrifice ethical standards to the pursuit of one simple goal, giving pleasure to its devotees. So pleasure is only interested in pleasing us, the audience, at the expense of truth. And this is what Plato was very uncomfortable with, right? So if you look at Republic 6, and there are so many passages also in the Apology and the Gorgias, right? And I think the main criticism, the main fear in Plato is that poetry addresses itself, it caters for a mass audience. So you sacrifice a lot of things, standards of propriety, because you want people to be pleased, you want to make them laugh, perhaps. Anyway, so what is very good is pseudos at the end of the day, but it has to be plausible, it has to combine topithanon. So tell the student this. The student must be forewarned. That, this happens in literature, and so he has to be on his guard. And then 19 AC, and the tutois, in discerning between good and bad characters, eu mala prosecteon etinas ho poetis autos emphases didosi kataton legomenon hos dus kairenomenon hub autu. And then he cites Menander, a prologue from this very, very funny play called Thais. It's a parody, really, of the opening of the Odyssey. So, sing to me, a goddess of such a woman who is, I don't know if I have the translation for you. Oh yes, oh sing to me my muse of such a girl, one bold and fair, beautiful, and of persuasive tongue, unjust, exclusive, and demanding much, in love with none, but always feigning love. Well, what is he doing here? What is the poet doing here? Well, he is in effect forewarning us. So he's saying that close attention must be paid to whether the poet himself gives any hints. And these hints in Greek are emphases. It's not emphasis, but it's hints. Does the poet himself give any hints regarding the sentiments expressed to indicate that they are distasteful to himself? That's what he wants us to bear in mind. So he doesn't say, don't read this, it's about this very naughty girl, naughty young lady, perhaps a hetairai. No, he doesn't say stay away from that. But he's saying, well, Menander is really making fun of this girl, and he's telling us that he doesn't find her conduct either tasteful or morally proper. So he says, but the important thing is to transfer this to Homer. He says Homer has employed this message of hinting, giving very strong hints, emphases. How does Homer do this? In advance, he discredits the mean and calls our attention to the good in what is said. And the Greek is very important, I think, is interesting. He says, monon ou, he all but Homer, martyretai, kai diagorure, mete krestai, mete prosekein, os usin atopois, kai faulois. So what is he doing? He is I like this word. He's telling us to be careful. Pro diabale. Diabalo means, he is censuring, he is criticizing. But here he's doing it ahead of time. Pro diabale. So he quotes, Homer quotes, Plutarch quotes Homer. Then at once he spoke. His words were gentle and winning, and, another quote from Homer, he would stand by his side and speak soft words to restrain him. So he says, what is Homer doing here? He is discrediting in advance and telling us, that what Homer's doing is making an evaluative comment before a character's speech or action. So that's the important thing for us to remember, for the pupil to remember, that Homer makes an evaluative advance comment. So he judges the character in advance. Okay. 19d through 20a. This is interesting. If we read I'll read the English bit. He also employs his closing lines. I think in Greek it's epiremasi. Must be, yes, epiresisi. Epiresisi, it's epiresis. It's a closing comment. And it's like casting a vote. He's pronouncing a verdict, like a juror. So in the beginning, he can prodiabalein, that's what Homer does, in a sort of evaluative way, but he can also do it at the end with a closing comment. And so I'll read the English. He also employs his closing lines to good purpose, as though adding a sort of verdict of his own on what is done or said. So he's commenting on comments on conversation or on action. Of the adultery of Ares, he represents the gods as saying, and it almost sounds proverbial, evil deeds do not succeed, the swift by the slow is taken. Now these are all male gods, and I think they feel a degree of Schadenfreude. They're enjoying the sight of Ares. In the Odyssey, it's Odyssey 10. So the two lovers, the illicit lovers, are caught in Hephaestus's net, and so they're being almost moralistic, but also very hypocritical. Oh, this is too evil deeds, evil deeds. Oh, no. And because in a few seconds they're going to start laughing out loud. You'll see, two gods. So anyway, on the occasion of Hector's in great arrogance and boasting, he, Homer says, thus he spoke in boast. Queen Hera's wrath was kindled. And Plutarch continues, now these declarations and opinions contained in the words of the text may be discovered by anybody who will pay attention, but from the actions themselves the poets supply other lessons. So in the case which he's going to tell us, actions will speak louder than words, you might say. In Homer, this form of instruction is given silently. Now, sometimes people don't pay attention to Homer's silence. It goes over their heads, you might say, over their head. So they search for deeper meanings, for hyponoia, for under meanings, and they come up with allegorical interpretations, usually of in the case of sexual, scandalous content, they may say something, they come up with an allegory that is scientific or astrological. So what is he doing here? He says that the author Homer mentions disparagingly, Plutarch mentions disparagingly, he criticizes a competing school of interpretation, the allegorists, who in sanitizing offensive, immoral passages do violence to the text in order to suggest deeper meanings, hyponoia, of an astrological character. So, what is he saying? The student reads the story of the adultery, the scandalous episode, and so he shouldn't resort to astrological allegory. He must listen to what is going on, and Homer may give us some clues, and the clue may be contained in the offhand semi-serious remark that evil does not pay in the end. That's what he's saying. So Homer plainly, if silently, furnishes the lusus, the solution. But do you know what is interesting? He's encouraging the student, the young reader, to take an active role and realize the point of the story himself. Okay? That's what he's saying. If we can backtrack and look at Odyssey 8, it's still 7, item 7, I think it is, or no, 8, is it? Yes, 8. Well, the story, what?
Which one?
8, oh dear, let's see. It's Odyssey 8, 333 through 42, or is that not? Ah, yes, it's on page 7, forgive me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So he says in Odyssey 8, now, by the way, this section was omitted in some school texts, in manuscripts, because it was sort of not good for students or young pupils. But what is, you can see 326, that there was unquenchable asbestos enorto gelos, laughter, uncontrollable, you might say, laughter, emerged amongst the gods and goddesses, I think, here. And so they said to themselves, no, I think it's just gods, male gods. And then they said, uk areta kaka erga. So it does not pay to commit evil or foul deeds. So what you read in the English text was omitted in many school texts. But Plutarch says even if you're confronted with this text, you have to excavate it for clues. And they may be silent, they may be siopomena clues, or they may be explicit, you see. You know, in the beginning the poet may say this is horrible. Or just in the course of the episode he may have a little cliché, you know, good does not pay. Or somehow you have to extract it from the action. So basically he's calling for critical attention, and the student must cultivate that. Okay, I perhaps am doing too much here, trying. There's so much in Plutarch. My question is, how far in the episode did the young normally read? And as I looked into this, teachers may have stopped at 329, which sounds proverbial, and it's, you know, good does not pay, uk areta. And areta here is used as a verb, so it does not pay, uk areta kaka erga, or they may have stopped at 332. The line about, I think it's about unquenchable laughter. 332.
Kolos.
Yes, I think kolos eon teklis. Yeah, it may have ended there. But if you look at verses 333 through 42, we have two male gods, Hermes and Apollo, jesting, they're laughing. Look at them. And their laughter contradicts, it belies the proverb, you see. So the proverb is probably meant ironically, you see. But how do you explain this to a teenager, you see? So you must be able to do this, though. That's what he's saying. I think the interpretation he's advancing here, Plutarch, is that Demodocus' song, well, no, he's looking at it in a very unsophisticated way. But because there is laughter, it's very tricky here, so it's not an easy case. Anyway, St. Basil, or do I not have St. Basil here? Perhaps not. All to the good. But St. Basil also is not interested, but he condemns moikeas, theon kai erotas, kai mixes anaphandon. So he of course he's a churchman, he's a bishop, he doesn't like the adultery of gods and their love, passions, erotas, and their copulations. Yeah, that's what mixes, anaphandon, public. Oh, that's very scandalous. He doesn't like that. And so he says, all these we leave to stage people. Episkenes, tois episkenes, katalepsomen. We shall leave to those who, to mimes and actors and so forth. But notice that Plutarch is being a bit more reasonable and saying, let's try to see. Yeah. So Basil does not suggest a method of interpreting such morally embarrassing passages. So he says, just leave it to these Untermenschen. Okay, so 20D through E, toiauta, examples of tragic stichoglithia. So he's given examples of, these one-line exchanges. He says these things, tas luces eke prodelus. So it has solutions that are all too obvious, they're right in front of you. An prostaveltiona te crese tus neus kateuthenomen. If towards better things in their critical thinking, that te crese refers to the young people, I think. We guide them. So again, it's a nautical, a seafaring metaphor. We guide them. So I'll read it in English. For such passages as these admit of solutions, luces, which are obvious. Do you see that? As these admit of, if, as has been said, we stir the young in their judgment. That's very important. Cultivate the young's judgment, the judgment of the young, towards the better side. Prostaveltiona. But whenever anything said by such authors sounds preposterous and no solution is found close at hand, we must cancel out these, not by opposing. We must cancel out these by opposing to them things which the poets have said on the opposite side elsewhere. So he's saying, okay, this is embarrassing. Homer said this, but let's look at it, let's counterbalance it with something Homer said elsewhere. So counterbalancing, you have checks and balances. When a character in a poem, for example, a tragedy, he's talking about tragedy also, or Homer says something that is toplapton, we can find a lucis. And he uses this term, it's standard in the scholia, in the exegetic scholia. It's a solution to a difficulty. So you can find a solution from within the same author. Where? Well, you find a passage that says the contrary, so you cancel it out. And we instruct the student or the pupil to rely on his own krisis. Also, we must have the young reader remember that the poet has not been immoral, no, but rather the offensive words are spoken en ethe, in character, or with humorous intent. Meta paidias. So, okay, this is embarrassing, but Homer didn't feel this. He's just, he's impersonating, right, somebody, or this was said in with humorous intent. And here, what he's doing is shadow boxing in the background with the Epicureans, who said that poets contradict themselves, and therefore poetry is not useful. Okay. And now moving quite quickly, I hope, 21E. 21E, that's item 11 on page 9. If an author cannot be corrected by his own poetry, we can quote other authors. So if you're stumped, if you say, oh gosh, I can't find this in Homer, perhaps I can find it in Sophocles. So you quote Sophocles. So you tip the scales to the better. That's what he says in 21E. I won't quote it for you, but it's there. And then 22b through c, that's 12. This is interesting to me at least, because he uses these terms which we still use in modern Greek, in literary criticism. So he says, de, tas ekton parakemenon e symphrastomenon paralipein afirmas pros tin epanorthosin. Mede, so you shouldn't ignore things that are parakemenas, standing beside or spoken together. So symphrazomenon in modern Greek means context, immediate context. So don't ignore the immediate context. Al hosper iatroi tes cantharidos osis thanasimutus podas homos ketapterau poetein oiondai kai analuein ten dynamin hutos entois poeo. This is the important part. Kan onoma, kan rema, parakemenon ambluteran poe, ten prostokeron apagogein, epalambanesthai, kai prosdiasaphein, and so forth. And he gives us two examples. But let's read in translation what he says. We must not neglect either the means for rectifying a statement, which are afforded by the words that lie near, or by the context, and then he gives us a medical example. But the point is, so in poetry, if a word, and it's onoma, it's a very vague word, but onoma, or expression, rema, by its position next to another word, blunts the point which the passage in its worse interpretation would have, we should grasp it and use it as an expanded interpretation or explanation. So I'll give you the example. He says, I think he's quoting from Homer, of course he is, thus at the last can honour be paid by miserable mortals. And so in Greek it's oisiroisi. Do you see that? Oisiroisi, that's 12 from the Odyssey, I think. And he says, mortals are not all oisirois, they're not all miserable. So we need to play with we have to examine the context, the symphrazomena and the parakemena, and interpret it accordingly. So what is he saying? Well, not all mortals are miserable. He's just talking about a certain group at a certain time, you see. That's he's rationalizing, you might say. So what is this? This is an intratextual, not intertext, but intratext. It's a method, intratextual method, of correcting a troubling passage. But it works only with verses, or when verses are quoted out of context as gnomic. So this sounds gnomic. Anyway, the important thing for Plutarch is for the student to focus on the meaning of a noun, an adjective or verb, in the immediate context, which will blunt ambluteran poie. It will make less harsh, less sharp the worse interpretation. So, for the benefit of those who know modern Greek, and I'm sure all of you know modern Greek, not that you should, but the second example is hosgar. Do you see that? Hosgar epeklosandu te oi deloisi beprotoisi, and so forth. Deloisi, he says Deloisi means cowardly. and that's the post-classical meaning and modern Greek meaning of delos. It's not simply, so he's not talking about all mortals being miserable, but under certain circumstances being cowardly. So but it's pretty sophisticated, I think. Okay, 25D. Hei poetike, 25D. What is that?
Number 13.
13, oh, thank you, yes, number 13, item 13. He says that hoi poetike to pikiloi kretai kai polytropoi. So, but when poetic art is divorced from the truth, ane to alethus, then chiefly it employs variety, poikilon, you see, and diversity. For it is the changes of fortune, metabolai, that give to its stories the elements of the emotional, the surprising, and the unexpected. This all sounds like literary criticism of, in pseudo-Longinus, for instance, ecplixes and so forth. The poets do not represent the same people as always victorious or prosperous or successful in everything. No, not even the gods, when they project themselves into human activities, are represented in the poet's usage as free from emotional talk. So that the disturbing and exciting element of poetry should in no place lapse because the gods are free from danger and struggle. Oh gosh. What is he saying here? Because it lacks truth, poetry is polytropos, it does everything, and poikili, or poikile, it achieves variety through metabolai, changes of fortune, which heighten, increase, intenses of emotion and suspense, and thereby create ekplexes. Ekplexes is being hit on your head with something, it's being struck on your head, right? Ekplexes. Literally, that's what it is. Sameness, to haplun, is boring. So you'll see a lot of ups and downs in poetry, and that's why characters suffer a change, because people like ekplexes, strangely enough. They like being hit on the head, right? They like getting nervous and eating more popcorn, for instance, in a film, at a film. So characters suffer change from prosperity to its opposite. Sounds a bit like the poetics, right? The peripetia, or peripetai as they say in English. Even the gods, as he says, are portrayed as going through these ups and downs, and mortals can be erring. They can err, they can sin. They are not anamartetoi. They are not without, not sin in the Christian sense, but without making blunders, committing blunders. Hence they are imperfect. So he's saying that gods in poetry and men certainly are imperfect. And here he's echoing, as I said, Plato and especially Aristotle. And Plato in Republic 10 says that the irrational part of the soul is activated by mimesis. Reasoning remains always the same. It is haplun. But people don't like haplun. They don't like haplun. They like ups and downs. And that's why mimesis is dangerous, of course. It's very alluring. It's very good for you. So he's saying that students, readers, should be aware of this. Which I really question whether they could realize all this at such a tender age. Okay, 26A through B. Oh, where is that? I can't even find it on
Item 14.
Okay, item 14. Now he's starting to sound like Plato, I think. Let the young man then not get into the habit of commending anything like this, nor let him be plausible and adroit in making excuses. You see, many young readers would make excuses for immoral behaviour, or they would come up with sophistic solutions. No. Let him, the reader, young reader, cherish the belief that poetry is an imitation of character and lives, and of change in their ways for the better. Okay. The man who admires everything and accommodates himself to everything, whose judgment, because of his preconceived opinion, is enthralled by heroic names, will unwittingly become inclined to conform to much that is base. What he's saying is that poetry has a star system. Young people, impressionable, look at these Hollywood-type gods and heroes, and they come to admire them even in their immoral conduct or moments. So you have to encourage the student, the reader, to say he must acquire the habit of exclaiming with confidence, wrong, improper, no less than right and proper. Men who are not perfect or spotless or unassailable in all respects, and so on and so forth. So basically what is he saying here? That poetry is, sounds like Plato, poetry is a mimesis of ethe and bioi, and of men who are ruled by emotion and false doxa, but who also can change for the better. Young readers should not be, as I said, starstruck, right? They should be prepared when reading tragedy or comedy to castigate, to criticize Agamemnon or Achilles in their more questionable moments. They are not perfect. So if he becomes too tolerant of these very glamorous characters, he will tend to the fouler, the unworthy, lowly things. So the young man must be trained to say, and I quote him, orthos, correctly, this is good, bravo, or prepondos, or uk orthos, kai u prosecondos, you see. And the terms used in these terms are used in the ancient Schola. That's what's very interesting. If you read the Schola, they say prosecondos, they say orthos, and so forth. Okay. So critical thinking is vital to the philosopher. This little boy who's reading, or he may not, he's a teenager, he is a philosopher in the state of becoming. Yeah. And if you read a bit more closely, and I won't do it now, he uses the term kata de doulomenos, that one can be enslaved, right? It's a sort of douleia, or ethelo-douleia, when you read classical authors. Generally, it's not simply that Achilles is appealing, or Agamemnon, but it's classical literature. Now, remember, this is a post-classical period, so he said, don't be overly impressed by the canon. I think that's what he's saying. If you uncritically admire everything in literature, you may end up being faulos, you see. So that's what he says. It's very, very interesting. And then 27a through b, that's item 15 on pages 11 and following. This is interesting too. He says, when there's some degree of asaphia, uncertainty or lack of clarity, how do you judge this when there's an action, a series of events. So I'll do it in English. But in cases where Homer's judgment is not made clear, so it's ta asaphe, a distinction is to be drawn by directing the young man's attention in some such manner as the following. If, on the one hand, Nausicaa, you know this young princess, after merely looking at a strange man, Odysseus, and experiencing Calypso's emotions towards him, being as she was a wanton child and at the age of marriage, utters such foolish words as these to her maidservants, and this is a quote from Odyssey 6:244, "How I wish that a man like this might be called my husband, living here with us, and be contented to marry," then are her boldness and lack of restraint to be blamed. So you might, on first reading this, at first reading, think that Nausicaa, and she's just seen Odysseus coming out of the shower, right? And Athena has made him even more beautiful, more handsome than he is. And she looks at him and tells her maids, "Oh, I wish I could marry this man," right? Well, okay, that happens, but in the text, so what do? Is this boldness and lack of restraint? Or, on the other hand, does she see into the character of the man from his words and marvel at his conversation? So she's not being... she's interested in him intellectually, let's say. And so that's the line a teacher should take. And then that's why she says, "How I wish that he could stay on and I could marry him." She likes his conversation. You see. That's what a teacher should do. That's what he should tell. Yes. So, but as I said, or as Plutarch says, if Homer is asaphes, if he doesn't make clear his moral stance regarding a character's action, we must guide the student towards a moral interpretation, whether this is bad or this is good. And the teacher will have no doubt about Nausicaa's goodness. She is good. She's, you might say, she's a pure young virgin. So he will help the student to define her reaction to Odysseus in a positive light. That's what he's saying. So you can see that, But Plutarch says this. He encourages us in this direction. But the scholia, I looked up the scholia, and they say, I translate, the words are inappropriate for a young girl, and akolastoi. Do you know akolastos? It's indissolute, not so. Do you know St. Basil, and I'll discuss this tomorrow in his work on pagan education. He overlooked this sort of scholium or trend of thinking and said that this scene is beautiful and students should read it because Odysseus was clothed in virtue. You see? He was clothed in virtue. He was not naked. No. So he says that. But it's to St. Basil's credit that he doesn't say, this should never be touched or read or anything. So you can control the meaning of this. And I'll do that tomorrow. 30D, and this is something very important, I think, in poetry. It is an educational cliché. Can you see it, 30D?
Yes, 17.
Oh, page 17.
Page.
17.
Item.
Item 17. Item 17. Item 17. This is nice. Epe de hosper entais nomais, he men melita dioke to anthos, and so on and so forth. It's a simile. Hutos entais anagnosisi ton poematum homen apantizetai ten historia, and so forth. Hoide ton prosto ethos erimenon ophilimos ekondai, and so forth. What is he saying here? Just as in pasturage, in a beautiful pasture, in a meadow, the bee seeks the flower, the goat, this sounds very bucolic, and it is almost an echo of Theocritus, I think. So the bee seeks the flower, the goat, the tender shoot, the swine, the root, the other animals, and I think Zoa here refers to birds, the seed and the fruit. Everyone has his favourite. So in the reading of poetry, one person culls, he gathers the flowers of the story, and he means here the historia, the history and myth, the background. Another fixes his attention upon the beauty of diction and the artistic elaboration of words. So somebody is interested in the background, someone else is interested in the words, right? And there are those who are interested with what is said as being useful. No, but as for those, like ourselves, who are concerned with what is said as being useful for character, and it is to those that our present discourse is directed, let us remind them how scandalous it is if the lover of stories, the philomythos, does not fail to observe the aspects of the story which are innovative and unusual, and the philologos does not allow purity and rhetorical elegance to escape him. So imagine if this doesn't happen, but that the lover of the noble and honourable, and so on, does not take hold of poems for sport, but for education. So the point is, there are people interested in mythos, there are those who are interested in the surface elegance, the diction, and so forth, and it's quite natural. One isn't surprised if one doesn't attend to these features, but what is shocking is if somebody is not interested in the moral content of poetry, and yes, poetry. So we should be philomythoi, we should also be philologoi, but first and foremost we must be philotimoi and philokaloi. We should be interested in kalos as noble, nobility, and philotimoi as in lovers of timei, honour. That's the important thing. And then he quotes something from, I think it's Iliad 11, son of Tydeus, what has made us forget our swift prowess? Hither stand, my friend, by me. Disgrace will befall us if yon Hector, gleaming helmed, shall capture our vessels. So you can look at a lot of things and relate these three verses to mythos, and you can look at the beauty of the words and the rhythm and so forth. But what is the important thing here? The takeaway, as they say. You must observe a wise and prudent man, Odysseus, when he is in danger of being destroyed and lost, he fears shame, you see, but not death. So if you draw attention to this passage, and the son of Tydeus is Diomedes, and this is Odysseus basically saying to Diomedes, it is disgraceful to fall in battle. So death should not make us flee, right? That's what he's saying. Well, that is the point, he says. forget about the mythos and the beauty of the language. And this will make the young man passionate for virtue. This is what I like. And if you look at the Greek text, embathe, it's the end of the passage, embathe poiese pros aretein ton neo. Embathe is full of passion. It will make him passionate for arete. What is arete? Well, it seems to be here means military virtue, military arete. But okay, I've sort of strayed away from what is the main import of this passage, and it's quite influential because whether coincidentally or not, church fathers used this. It is an educational cliché. I think it goes back to Socrates, that the reader, the student, should be a discerning bee, melita, and look for paideia in literature, and he should look in particular for utterances, things said, and in Plutarch it's anapephonemena. So these are the utterances are the flowers that promote what? Andrea. What is Andrea? It is bravery. Sophrosune, that's what he says. Kai dikaiosune. Three of the four cardinal virtues were, what is the fourth cardinal virtue? It's phroneses. So these are the flowers we should try to get out of literature. So we have to be very busy but discerning bees. And further on he will say that virtue is teachable. That's interesting. It also sounds like Socrates, doesn't it? Virtue is didacte, and vice is ignorance. So, our task as teachers is to make students passionate about virtue. That's what Plutarch says. And notice he uses a verb in the Greek, it's apantizetai. Apantizetai. You know, pluck. Anthos, like a bee. But this whole notion, this is not my idea. It goes, it's Hunter and Russell who say this. It really is to do with students and writers looking for good expressions, bon mot, as you might say, to imitate. So it's mimesis as a rhetorical and educational tool. Right. So he's also talking about plucking out what is good, not only morally but stylistically. And this is also a period of renomic anthologies. A lot of, and you can trace this back to the 4th century, early 4th century, in Xenophon Memorabilia, gnomic anthologies of poets. Okay, 35F, I think we have time, 35F through 36A. Are we doing, how are we young? Okay.
Maybe we approach to the...
Oh, the end, okay. So, okay, you can take, okay, so remember he said that basically education, reading, learning to read Homer and so forth, and appreciating him is really a propaideia to philosophy, right? So you can read something in Homer and connect it to philosophy proper. So you can find something morally edifying. For instance, I think it is Athena, the goddess Athena, who says, do you see utoi teknonemon? He quotes that, and she's saying to Aphrodite, who's just been wounded in battle by Diomedes, oh dear, you know, you're not to do polemia erga. That's not your sphere. It's not your jurisdiction. you should do erga gamoil, right? And so forth. So what do you do with this? It sounds very, very silly. So what do? You connect it to gnothe sauton, know thyself, you see. And you can do the same with Pythagoras and other things in Plato, to make children's readings philosophical. Okay. And and then I come to 16, which is the peroratio. What does poetry do? Eti de, it's in bold, pro anoige, kai prokinei ten tu neo psukein, tois en philosophia logos. So it opens up, you see, it opens up the soul of the young man and stimulates it in advance to philosophical discourse. So, myth, Homer, myth generally, can be shown to have seriousness and to convey truth. Now, all this may sound very trite or obvious to you, but he spent an entire essay developing this idea. So, yeah. Patience, I hope I wasn't as rambling as the author, but it was a macrolohia.
Thank you for extremely stimulating lecture. The most valuable thing perhaps for our students is to appeal to be philologos, for a philologist. It's I think the most important thing. But maybe questions.
Yes.
Какие вопросы? Да.
Plutarch created such a straight system of studying and analyzing poetry, the system of check and balances. Yes. And how should you treat, for example, Pindar or Crete in this system? Who Pindar? I don't know.
Pindar,
Yes. They was quietly praising about their heroes.
yes.
I don't think that in poetry of Pindar there is any examples of the bad actions of the heroes of him.
Right.
So how we should treat this poetry only from the grammatic way of studying. So what the moral thing there? Can we just ignore it and study it like an example of good languages and words, or just?
Well, he says go beyond that. Go beyond the these superficial, these very pleasing sounds of the sirens. You see, and of course he admits that poetry causes or produces hedone, right? In the Aristotelian poetics sense, but the important thing at the end of the day is to learn more arete. It's an education in arete, and I think Pindar lends himself to that, doesn't he? To arete, yes. But he's very Plutarch is nervous about Homer, as was everyone from Xenophanes onwards. These very scandalous scenes, undignified scenes. There is anthropomorphic morality. This is what he had to deal with. And don't forget, Homer was the key text, the canonical text. It really was in education at all levels. So he deals with Homer in extenso, and also with tragedy, and things that statements about the gods. He's not worried really about Pindar. No, he's not. But this is a very traditional way of thinking in ancient times, you see. It's educational philosophy, what I tried to present, and it's also reader response. That's a new. It's a school criticism that is about 40 years old now, especially in the United States, or reception aesthetic, as you know, and it's centered on the reader's response. And Aristotle seems to have been a reader response person, because he looks at things as a reader. How might Aristotle been affected by this, you see? So this is, I mean, it may sound banal, a lot of things he's, and a lot of, but he uses grammar to rescue the moral content of poetry.
Thank you.
Good. Some more questions? We have questions also from our audience in internet. Audience of our,
I'm glad you didn't tell me that.
Yes, from the whole world.
Yes. So we have this. It's not a question, rather a commentary and a praise of your previous lecture. So I shall read it, perhaps. It's rather short.
And as I said, I shall provide bibliography for both lectures.
This story about monsters is genuinely charming and very useful to make young folk acquainted to the ancient authors. We've just discussed with my 9-year-old English student the echidna. Don't ask why the context goes too far. And now I may give her some useful references. Experiments on children in philology are used to have brilliant outcome. So this is
yes. That's very good. Yes. Well, thank you very much, Vasilia.
Yes, it was a feedback.
Yes. Thank you very much for the feedback. Yes.
Maybe questions too.
I was wondering whether these four virtues, who was the author of these virtues? Could you remind me, please?
The fourth was Phronesis.
Phronesis, yes.
Dikaiosune, Andrea, and Sophrosyne.
Who was the first to come with these four?
I think it's Aristotle in the Nicaean.
Thank you very much.
But he's interested in everything, really. And he's a middle Platonist. This is a term that has always, it almost sounds insulting to Platonism, middle. But it's in terms of, it's between Plato and Plotinus. So anyway, he's very eclectic, and like all middle Platonists, he's open to many ideas. But St. Basil, as I shall tell you tomorrow, if you come to my talk, in Greek, the modern Greek, St. Basil followed Plutarch. I don't know if he used Plutarch as a blueprint, but they share sources of educational thinking. But I do think he did know of Plutarch's work and use it.
Perhaps students are still formulating their questions, but if there are no questions for the moment, let us express our thanks.
I thank you for your. As I said, it is quite an honour to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
Okay, so the next lecture of Professor Petropoulos will be tomorrow, and it will be the Department of Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies.
Yes. Спасибо.
Thank you.
Большое. Спасибо.